So we're now moving to the next panel, which is by Joanne McAndrews and Robert Barwick. This is dealing with a credit system for Australia, the American system precedent, King OMalley, and Australia's National Bank. So I'll hand over to Joanne and Robbie.
All right. Ready for another hour or two of this? Yeah, come on, admit it. This is what you're here for. Not all that religious mumbo-jumbo yesterday. This is the good stuff, right? That's why we came. So stay awake. Come on. No. All right. Just to get the juices flowing, pop quiz. I got a pop quiz that you can to determine whether you're a monetarist or a supporter of public credit. All right. So this is a personal question to ask yourself. You've just been shipwrecked and washed up alone on a tropical island like Robinson Crusoe, or what's his name, Tom Hanks. All right, after a few days you stumble across a piece of luggage, like a suitcase from the shipwreck. What do you hope is in it? Money or tools? Booze. All right. Who hopes there's money in there? Good old Alan, the contrarian. All right, so none of you guys are monetarists. That's good. Yes, there's always a problem, Richard. No, what about those Samsonite ones? They'd float, wouldn't they? Those really tough ones? Anyway, all right. We're trying to keep these presentations brief, so we're going to, go pretty expeditiously through this. The purpose of what I want to do now, following on from Joe, is to demonstrate quite clearly that our system in Australia, in the form of the Commonwealth Bank, the national bank that Australia devised, contrary to a lot of disinformation, was entirely and explicitly based on the principles that Joe has just laid out, that the American, over a long time, developed. Right. So, in other words, you could say it was based on those Christian principles. That you have a monetary system that has that is based on a respect and a love of humanity and mankind, and therefore all those questions that come into that of having a physical economy that develops so that the standard of living of the people is uplifted, is supported by the money system, right? And that is what Australia, for a period of time, had. And we're one of the few countries, in fact, there's probably, and you'll see this more this afternoon, it's doubtful there's any other country outside of Australia, other than Australia, outside of the United States, that actually had an explicitly American-style system. Others were able to copy it to a degree, with certain institutions like the Credit and Stolt für Wiederaufbau Reconstruction Bank in Germany after World War II, but not in the way that our Commonwealth Bank was for a time able to function, right? And it was because of the American system and this guy. So let's just go through it. And I got a lot of quotes as well. What I'd like to do, though, also is we're doing this part of the conference as, in a sense, to drill you guys. You're not here to observe. You're here to be skilled up in this. All right? Because this is our mission. What's our election platform this year? Glass-Steagall, National Bank and Great Development Projects. And put up your hands if you're not a candidate yet. All right, someone take down names. We'll talk about that more this afternoon. So anyway, to that end, I can handle it. Feel free to interrupt me with questions as we go along. If something you're reading makes you think, oh, what about that, right? Because I don't mind discussing as we go along, just so you're clear and we don't lose anybody. Anyway, first slide, please. So this is, I just want to start with another quote from Hamilton in his 1795 report on public credit, which, correct me if I'm wrong, Joe, but would mean that the bank was operating for 4 years by this time, right? I think it started in 1791. This is the first bank. So Hamilton reports, no well-informed man can cast a retrospective eye over the progress of the United States from their infancy to the present period without being convinced that they owe in a great degree to the fostering influence of credit their present mature growth. This credit has been of a mixed nature, mercantile and public, foreign and domestic. Credit abroad was the trunk of our mercantile credit, from which issued ramifications that nourished all the parts of domestic labour and industry. The bills of credit emitted from time to time by the different local governments which passed current as money cooperated with that resource. Their united force, quickening the energies and bringing into action the capacities for improvement of a new country, was highly instrumental in accelerating its growth. And so the point there is, what's Hamilton's motivation? Developing his nation, right? And that's where credit is an issue. The whole point to Hamilton's way of thinking of a money system was, what's it doing? Not who's getting rich, what is it doing, right? And of course, his part was to make sure that public credit played a role. And there's another great quote. There's a pack out there actually that we've compiled some of the legislation, the Nawapa report and the Andrew Jackson report in it. And there's another great quote in the Nawapa report section on credit where he talks about, he makes this point that we've got public credit and private credit. And of course, in the private credit part of the economy, you know, run by the private bankers, there were plenty of bankers who were saying, well, we don't like the public credit. We want to go back to total control, right? We don't know what. Let's have all credit being private. And Hamilton said, if you get that, what will happen is not only will you lose the public credit part, but the total private credit will shrink as well. Because public credit grew the overall economy so much that the private credit part of the economy was able to expand much more than it would have on its own, right? So in other words, what are you whinging about? Exactly, always. There's no actual financial motivation to oppose national banking. It's not about money. It's not the money interest opposition to national banking isn't because it affects their profits. It's because it affects their power. Right, that's the point. Okay, so the American system, though, broke something. And what it broke was what Elisa went through a little bit yesterday, and I'll recap now. It broke, close to a millennium of Venetian monetary control. Next slide. So this is the Venetian system. We'll just I'll give you some of the details here. Oh, hang on. What we got? Okay. This is very. We're gonna publish a paper on this soon, which is from some good research. But here's how the Venetians developed it. So they organised the Crusades. And the poor mugs fighting the Crusades, they thought they're fighting for God and against the infidel and whatever. Meanwhile, the guys who sent them to do it, who set it up, the Venetians, all they're looking is, oh man, we're taking over the trade routes to Persia, India and China here. That's what they were interested in. Now, up until 1000 AD, Western Europe used silver as a currency. The Byzantine and Islamic empires used gold. So what Venice created was a bimetallic money system that they could manipulate, because that's the euro now, yeah. One of the key dates was 1260, when the Mongols forced China off gold onto paper currency. Now that's not, it's not necessarily bad in and of itself, as the Massachusetts guys proved, but it depends on what your motivation is. And what it had the effect of doing, because this is, you know, who was the famous Italian explorer in the Mongol Empire? Where was he from? Marco Polo, from Venice. And he really got himself ingratiated into the among the Mongol emperors. And in this period, a huge amount of gold that had no further actual practical use anymore in China, right, which was the biggest part of the world economy, was able to be taken out and shifted over to Europe. And it was shifted into, a lot of it ended up being held in that church, St. Mark's Basilica in Venice. It was the biggest fund of loot for centuries and centuries and centuries. And in fact, it was we talk about the Bank of England being the world's first private central bank. For all intents and purposes, the Basilica, what was called the Procuratia of St. Mark's Basilica was it, right? Now, here's the key bit. The way they got their profits was not by actually trading. I mean, there's a little bit of trade that, but so much of these ships were dedicated to shipping bullion back and forth, right? All the spices, the Chinese guys and the Indians and the Persians, they made their profits from the spices they were able to sell to the West. But the Venetians made their profits through arbitrage. And you had there's a ratio up there, if you can see that. Silver was valued higher in China, where 1 mark of gold was 4 marks of silver, as opposed to Europe at the same time, where 1 mark of gold was 12 marks of silver. So the Venetians, they just made money exploiting the difference. That's called arbitrage, right? Buy cheap, sell dear. It's currency speculation, and that's all it ever was. And at the height of even at the height of the East India Company, the world's greatest private monopoly, the biggest part of its profits still came from that. This currency speculation in silver and gold with China, it lasted into the 20th century. And it was run out of these Venetian, Dutch, and then British trading houses, right? So these are not people who loan you money because you're going to do something productive with it. They're thinking, how can we loot? And there's no better way of looting than this. And of course, this is now, since 1971, the Bretton Woods system, this is now how the world economy operates with the floating exchange rate system. So all those cowboys, foreign exchange traders get to do their thing. And you guys notice those ads on TV for platforms for foreign exchange trading? Where's Graham? He probably dabbles in it. It's such a big part of it now. All these day traders, schmucks who dropped out of work to sit on their computers, on ComSec and whatever, and make their money that way now, and they run ads for them. What a good life they have. There must be a lot of them, because then they get sold these platforms. Oh, I use this system, or I use this system. And what are they doing? All they're doing is on a computer screen moving values back and forth to make money through arbitrage. And there's nothing productive about it. Well, the Venetians set that up in this system. And of course, by creating a bimetallic system, it was even easier, because then you could always manipulate on a short term the relative values of gold to silver at a local level. And so many times, because the poor people, gold was scarce for them, right? That most daily transactions, your spare change was in silver. Many times, the Venetians were able to create, I think they were known as silver famines in Europe, because they were able to manipulate so much out in a hurry through manipulating the value of gold and get a lot of it converted into gold and get the silver shipped over to China. And then finally, the Venetian Doge, Mocenigo, he actually boasted, and I don't have the quote in there, but it was an explicit quote about what a great deal this was for them. 40% annual profits Venice accounted for at this period. 40%. And of course, there's nothing in the real productive world that can ever pay that, right? And that is, though, what Babcock and Brown and Macquarie Bank were boasting of their annual profits in 2007, before everything blew up in their face. They were boasting 40%. And the banks now in Australia, they boast about 20% annual returns. But then so do Coles and Woolworths. And, anyway, the reason I'm telling you this is because King OMalley really went after this kind of mentality. By the time of the American Revolution that Joe went through, Venetian monetarism had a new headquarters, and it was in the City of London, right? Lisa went through that yesterday. Next quote, please. Next slide. So this quote here epitomises how the system worked. It's important to note that, of course, when this takeover of London happened by the Venetians, not everyone in England was happy about it. In fact, there's plenty of... there's a good current of humanity in England to this very day, right? There actually is. And one of the things that the Brits, or the English and the Scots and that can be proud of is, some real contributions to physical economy, such as very impressive engineering and things like that, right? And that's humanity at work. That's creativity at work. And there was a question yesterday, how do we know, I think John might have asked, how do we know all this stuff about this Venetian takeover? One of the ways we know it is because of the backlash in England at the time to what was going on. And so if you know your 20th century history, the more famous prime ministers of England, in the 19th century were this guy, Gladstone, and his counterpart Disraeli. You heard of Disraeli? Benjamin Disraeli wrote explicitly about how it worked, right? And the term Venetian party, which we use, that the Brits, that was their own term for the faction that took them over. And Benjamin Disraeli was using that term in his writings up into the 1800s. Anyway, this quote came about because Gladstone in the 1850s had, for problems with the economy at the time, he'd tried to create some postal banking systems and got into trouble for it. Right now, he wasn't trying to topple Queen Victoria or anything like that. He certainly wasn't revolutionary. He was just being English. But at the same time, he was trying to run his government, right? Do certain things. He's the treasurer at the time. He's the Chancellor of the Exchequer. He's trying to balance the books. He's trying to make sure the economy works. He's accountable for that after all. So he has this idea, and doubtless it would have been influenced by the success of the United States. You can't have a successful national banking system like America implemented without the whole world taking notice, right? And the Brits were never stupid. And plenty of people in England were going, well, why aren't we doing things like that? So there was this proposal for a postal banks, and he got into real trouble for pursuing that. And he said this: the hinge of the whole situation was this: the government itself was not to be a substantive power in matters of finance, but was to leave the money power supreme and unquestioned. And that quote, that defines the British monetary system to this day, right? But of course, and to this day, it's no more true than now that is how the system works. But in the meantime, there's been a huge fight where a lot of progress was made. So, in terms of this fight, the country that outside the United States had the greatest success was our own. So I'm going to go through King OMalley now, but in the context of this, and this is a part you've got to really pay attention to, what we are pushing is not airy-fairy, pie-in-the-sky, wishful thinking. All we are seeking to do in our National Bank proposals that we're campaigning for is to revive a system that worked. And the reason the system is not in place today is because it worked. Right? And so when you get out there and you're arguing this point, don't back down. And if you want to be inspired by someone, be inspired by this guy. So let me just go briefly through King OMalley. I just want to recap a slight bio of him because I don't want to make this the most of the presentation. So there's in the 1970s there was a play written that that took credit for reviving the Australian theatre, and it was by Bob Butler's mate Bob Ellis, and it's called The Legend of King OMalley. And the thing is, a lot of OMalley is a legend, right? So it really is hard to pin down what's totally true and what's not. But we've done a pretty good job. And that's not a discredit to O'Malley, because in fact, I'm pretty convinced it's a total credit to him, because he was never dumb. And as Mark and I were talking about, security means you've got to be paranoid sometimes. And O'Malley O'Malley knew what he wanted to achieve, and he knew that he could not to achieve that in Australia by being totally open and completely honest about everything. Because, the big issue was him being an American in the first place. Because as an American, he would never have got elected to Parliament. Right? And he was an American. All this Canadian stuff is rubbish. But he had to say he was Canadian to get himself elected to Parliament. But he was here on a mission. And so here's some of it. He definitely worked in his uncle's bank in New York City. That was his first job. He started off as a teller there, and it was in that job he learned banking. And what he learned is what bankers know that the average person probably doesn't know. A lot of people here looking into this subject start to find out about, and you realise, you hear about things like fractional reserve banking for the first time. Oh, they're just creating money, and it's like, oh, how can they do that? Well, that's how banking works, right? And the average person on the street just thinks, oh, I'll give them my deposit and they give me back some interest and don't bother thinking about it. So you've got to sort of be in a bank to watch it working, or a victim of a bank to wonder how it's working, right? And O'Malley was in a bank and watched it working and thought, this is a pretty good system. I'm going to master this, and he did. So he worked there for a number of years. He got promoted quite well. Then for some reason, he went west selling insurance. Now, he travelled extensively. In 1884, as part of his travels, he campaigned for James Blaine for president. Now, James Blaine is a very interesting character, and when Tony Chaikin was here a few years ago, he gave a presentation on this, because there's some misunderstandings about O'Malley, and one story is that he campaigned for Blaine's opponent, and he didn't. He campaigned for Blaine. Blaine was one of the last great champions of this American system of national banking. That's what he was. Plus, he was the Secretary of State before he campaigned for president. He fought the takeover of the Republican Party, which was the Lincoln Party. He fought its takeover by the New York bankers. Here's a quote about the machine in New York, he calls it. He said this to the president in 1880, quote, "This section contains all the desperate bad men of the party, bent on loot and booty, and ready for any Mexican invasion or Caribbean annexation." And those two references, of course, are to British interests in the Western Hemisphere, right? "And looking to excitements and filibustering, and possibly to a Spanish war as legitimate means of continuing political power for a clique. These men are harmless when out of power and desperate when in possession of it." So Blaine was very combative. He was very much a soldier in the fight to keep the American system flame alive at a time when it was hard work. He ran for president because the previous guy, Garfield, who was the Secretary of State for, got assassinated. And some of this material comes out of a pamphlet the LaRouche guys did on this, Why the British Kill American Presidents. But the guy who assassinated Garfield, 2 months before he assassinated him, he wrote, his name was Charles Guiteau, so he's the assassin. He wrote to the president, his future victim, on May 23rd, 1881. He wrote this: "Mr. Blaine is a wicked man, and you ought to demand his immediate resignation. Otherwise, you and the Republican Party will come to grief." And 2 months later, the man who wrote that assassinated the president, right? Because that's, it was Blaine that was the real danger in this administration. So here's O'Malley, as a young man, campaigns for this person, this James Blaine. And interestingly, years later, 1947, when O'Malley was past having to pretend as much as he had to sort of create an image for himself early on in Australia. So, 1947, in the autumn of his life, he had this correspondence with this guy who wrote a book about him, Jauncey, and he said in that correspondence, if Blaine had have won, I was going to be the ambassador to Chile. And that's very, very telling. And it really got Tony thinking, because Tony Chaikin, who authored Treason in America, knows this history backwards. And that there alone, and OMalley's role in the Blaine machine, made him suspicious, for good reason, that OMalley was probably sent to Australia as an agent. Now that's not confirmed, but what we do know is that the standard story is probably not right. And the reason it's probably not right is probably because it is a cover. Because the standard story is he had advanced tuberculosis, he thought he was going to die. He was sitting on the park bench in San Francisco, and some sailor sat down beside him, "Oh, where are you from, sailor?" "I'm from Australia." "Oh, I'm dying." "Oh, go to Rockhampton. That'll cure anyone." So he jumps on a ship and goes to Rockhampton and gets dumped off at Gracemere and gets looked after by Aborigines, and he turns up in Melbourne for the Centennial Exhibition in 1888, right? With that story behind him. Well, it's probably not true. So if it's not true, it's probably a cover. And if it's cover, it's probably because he was an American agent in the tradition of Edgar Allan Poe and who wrote The Last of the Mohicans? James Fenimore Cooper. Good on you. And the reason I'm saying that is because James Fenimore Cooper, there's a whole bunch of famous American authors who were agents. And the reason I want to mention Fenimore Cooper, of course, is one of his more interesting books was an expose of Venice called The Bravo. Anyway, Bob Ellis, and I don't know where Bob did his research, but Bob did research for his play. He makes a claim about OMalley as well, which is, I'm quoting it not because it's known to be true, but because it's detailed. So I'm guessing Bob had a reason to do it. And this is in the period from the presidential election of 1884, where his candidate Blaine lost, to 1888, where he arrived in Australia. And Ellis reports that OMalley travelled abroad from America. He travelled, and this is the quote from Ellis, quote, he travelled, quote, to Ireland, whose ancestral spirits stirred him, to Wales, whose miners' slave-like conditions inflamed his radicalism, to Scotland, where he studied banking, to Russia, where he traced the snowbound retreat of his hero Napoleon, to Germany and England, where he studied banking. He became obsessed with banking. All right, and that's really interesting because, of course, that's what I don't know about the Napoleon reference, but I mean, OMalley claimed that he sold insurance to the Tsar of Russia and to everybody. So. But this studying of banking at the source, effectively, is very interesting because, you know, when he came to Australia, even his fiercest critics, no one ever said he didn't know what he was talking about. And in fact, the reason why is because he knew more about banking than anyone, right? Even bankers, and that was, you know, they didn't react to his knowledge of banking. Because they wouldn't have got away with it. They reacted to his image, you know, this American bounder, or this Yankee bounder. All right. Okay, so he comes in 1888. He's known from that point, for the first 5 years, he lived between Melbourne, Hobart, Launceston, and surrounds. And when I was reading this the other day, I mean, he sold insurance in Scottsdale, where Adrian was from. In fact, he probably went to Nabola, where Adrian was the Lord Mayor. That was his domain for quite a while. In fact, on the God question, some stupid schmucky minister in Launceston, there was an earthquake at the time, and this minister, wrote a letter to the paper saying, "This earthquake happened because I prayed to God to punish the sins of the people of Launceston, and God answered my prayers." And so 3 businessmen, one of whom was OMalley, sued him for damaging their business. If you have that power, then you should pay for it, right? Because poor OMalley, he's the insurance guy. Yeah, this was quite damaging for his business. Anyway, Oh, so the first record of him publicly advocating a national bank was in 1893. He wrote a letter to the editors to the Adelaide Register where he was living. Now, what's important about that, of course, is because the banking crisis of all banking crises was the year earlier, 1892. You know, where 20 out of 22 Australian banks hit the wall. It was really brutal. One of the, and I know, Bob, you've been looking at how some of the reactions to that, and I was talking to Graham as well yesterday. One of the reactions to that in Victoria was they did a Cyprus here that they're doing now, where they didn't give people their deposits and they said, oh, you get shares instead, right? Which was just but more interesting was what the New South Wales Premier at the time did, George Dibs, because OMalley said later he thought what Dibs did, given the circumstances, was pretty good, because what Dibs did, there was all this money. The way they put it is all these banks are shut. What that means is there's always money shut up in the banks, and the people don't have access to money, right? And so Dibs, to alleviate the shortage of currency, he guaranteed banknotes that the banks issued themselves their own notes. He guaranteed them as legal tender that the state would back by gold up to £300, right? So that there was no excuse to not get money circulating. And what Dibs did must have been not too bad, because all the other conservative British-dominated state premiers thought it was way too radical, right? And they didn't want to go along with it. So later on, OMalley thought, that was pretty good. In 1893, he writes this letter to the editor in the Adelaide Register where he goes on record in the written record. Doesn't mean he wasn't known for national banking before that, but he's on the written record advocating the American system of national banking for Australia, right? And that's just as a citizen in Adelaide. In 1896, he got elected to the Legislative Assembly of South Australia for Encounter Bay. Here's one of those little clues that tell you something. He refused to swear the oath of allegiance. Now, interestingly, he wasn't the only one. So that probably saved him, because some people didn't do it for conscience reasons. There was against their religion or something to swear oaths. OMalley, he wouldn't have done it for one reason only. It would have been perjury, because he was not a Canadian. He wasn't in the Commonwealth at all. Right? He was an American citizen, and he knew that, but he had to keep that as his cover. Anyway, he's in there for 3 years, and then, one of his pet beefs was booze. So, sorry, no one's perfect. The anti-temperance forces rallied against him and voted him out in 1899, which was good, though, because the planning for federation was well and truly underway by then, and he could get serious about getting into Parliament. So he goes back to Tasmania. He campaigns for the federal seat of Darwin, which is the west coast of Tasmania. He had a few things on his platform, but the two big issues that resonated was an old age pension and a national bank, right? And no one denies that from the opening of the first Parliament, the one voice for a national bank in Australia was King OMalley, and he used every speech he gave on any subject that the Parliament was debating, he put it in the context of a national bank, right? And in so doing, he educated people. He won as an independent, but because he found himself very quickly agreeing with the Labor Party, within a year or so he joined the ALP caucus, and from then on he was a Labor Party Member of Parliament. So in 1902. Now, I want to highlight two things at the time that he did that demonstrated not just that he's an American and he's banking, but a deep understanding of the American system. One's funny. 1901. Some of you might know that the first big economic dispute in Australia, at the time of federation, was protectionism versus free trade. And broadly speaking, the people from New South Wales were regarded as free traders, and the people from Victoria were regarded as protectionists. Sorry about this, I've had a cold. Anyway, Labor was unabashedly protectionist, except for one of them. And that one was Billy Hughes. Now, Billy Hughes is so bad that this is how bad he is, right? And it doesn't get any worse than this. That the person that I've since had cause to compare him to is Kevin Rudd. As a guy, you think, what is he doing in the Labor? I mean, you wonder what they're all doing in the Labor Party, but Kevin Rudd is so bad that when he was riding high, I remember Gabby and I were talking, this is the next Billy Hughes, this guy. So Billy Hughes, 1901, he's given this argument, he's debating in favour of free trade, yet he's in the Labor Party. He was one of the founders of the Labor Party. You look at the founding Barcaldine meeting thing, he's there, right? But he's given this thing about free trade. And then he makes this mistake. He's pontificating, little upstart, about how free trade's the only thing going. And he challenged the protectionist members of the Parliament to name one economist of note of European and worldwide standing who supported their theory. Because he's just confidently assuming everyone's a free trader. All the economists are free traders. So this American accent said, Henry Carey of the United States. Now, of course, Henry Carey, to have an appreciation of Henry Carey is an indication of how well trained OMalley was in the American system, because Henry Carey was the giant theorist of American system of political economy, and especially the question of protectionism and free trade. By the way, I meant Blaine was a protege of Henry Carey, a direct protege of Henry Carey. So this shows that how deep OMalley's understanding was. Anyway, when he interjected like this, poor old Billy Hughes, he didn't know what to make of this yank, and he'd never heard of Henry Carey, so he said, well, he mentions Henry Carey, no one's ever heard of that guy, and in Parliament through debates there's rules, and OMalley shouldn't have interjected in the first place. Billy Hughes has got the floor. Anyway, OMalley wouldn't shut up, and it just descended into an argument for the rest of the thing, and Billy Hughes had to finally give up. And Billy Hughes hated OMalley for the rest of his life. And in fact, one of the reasons there's this dispute, to me it seems totally ridiculous, but there's a desire to try and pretend that the Commonwealth Bank that we got had nothing to do with King OMalley. There's a rewriting of history, and the source of that is Billy Hughes. Right? The Commonwealth Bank had nothing to do with OMalley. Anyway. All right, and here's another thing that's important. I just wanted to highlight OMalley's understanding, because see, the time OMalley lived in the States coincided with the greatest single reversal of the American system, in the form that Lincoln had established it, and the national banking that he used in the Civil War, which was this thing called the Specie Resumption Act, if you've heard of that, where the New York bankers made sure that the greenbacks had the government could pay its bonds out in greenbacks in their paper currency, and the New York bankers reasserted their power in 1879 to make sure that stopped, and the bonds had to be payable in gold, right? And OMalley, he went after that big time. He goes, many years ago in America, when specie payments were resumed, several of the large brokers of Wall Street, and I am sorry to say several bankers, combined to make the United States pay heavily for the resumption. They demanded all their payments in greenbacks, and when they had secured about $250 million worth, they demanded gold from the sub-treasurer. Of course, the sub-treasurer did not have that amount of gold, and a contract had to be given which enabled those men to float gold bonds, with the result that half a dozen syndicates made a profit of several $1 million. So let's just go through these quickly. I just want you to see some of these quotes. We'll have to jump over a bunch of them. But the whole purpose of this is to show that OMalley's proposal was totally grounded in physical economy, right? And his biggest hate was specie-based money systems. The idea. So this is what he says: the international system of exchange is an international method of fraud, and the reason is that the capitalists of the world have made gold the basis of the world's credit. If ever there was a time in the history of the world when someone should have the courage to change the whole of the ramifications and fabric of the system of finance, it is the present. Next one. This is about credit, and I want you to just think about Joe's quotes and the other quotes where all this resonates on that, right? I consider that notes are only a subsidiary power. Notes are only the capital of a national bank. We hear too much about notes in Australia. A cheque currency is infinitely superior to notes. An acceptance currency is infinitely superior to notes. A deposit currency is infinitely superior to notes. I do not know that I would issue notes at all. It is only in little transactions you use money. The true medium of exchange is fortified credit. He has this interesting description, next one, of how he just makes this point. The medium exchange is between producers and consumers. That's the whole point. You've got producer, medium exchange, consumer. And because there's a lag between the production and the consumption of goods, the management of that credit in between is a very important responsibility, right? And pardon, Callum? Well, that's his point. So this is the quote on that. He said, the development of credits has reference to production and their payment to consumption. There must always be an indefinite period between production and consumption. Consumption cannot be definitely accelerated, and the power to purchase, once having been issued, cannot be withdrawn until the products of the producers have been demanded for consumption. Under such conditions, there must always be a mighty armada of credit floating in the sea of trade and commerce. As production and consumption are perpetual processes, as is also the banking function, the institutions which refuse to exchange their credits with the producers and traders during the interregnum between production and consumption inflict irreparable injury on the community and neglect their sacred function. We have seen the wrecks of the Australian financial crises trampling the roads with their swags on their back. Next quote, please. So by 1908, King O'Malley went to the Labor Party Brisbane conference with a detailed banking proposal. And we can make up a pack of this, because I'm not going to be able to go through all these quotes, where people can see the detailed proposal and try and wrap your head around understanding it, because it's worth doing. But here's the gist of it. Apart from the question of credit and how it works in a physical economy, the gist of it was he wanted a bank that could bank to the federal and state governments. He wanted a bank that could do what Joe read Hamilton saying had to be done for the United States, right? To unite it together, and this bank could do it, because Jack Lang would write later on how, as separate colonial governments, the states had to go to London, the city of London, to borrow money, right? And they all borrowed separately. They borrowed in competition with each other. The London banks could play them off against each other. They had to borrow at high interest rates as a result of that, and Australia just got looted non-stop. And O'Malley said, none of this has to happen. We can change all that. Quote, fancy a nation of 4 million people possessing an income of 40 million annually, having no corporate national institution whereby it can utilise 1 penny of that power. I want to have a bank which will be a department in itself, set apart by the law of the Commonwealth, to act in conjunction with the states. I do not desire to have a national bank to lend millions of pounds helter-skelter, but I want a banking system which can limit the issue, or in other words, the amount of the overdraft. The principal function of the bank would be to carry on operations with the states, the Commonwealth, the municipalities, the road trust, in fact, all institutions which have taxable property. Under my scheme, the bank will lend only credit. We should not borrow capital, but should create it, using the income from the customs house and the railways to be operated by means of our great national banking system. Next one, please. So then this is what he presents to the 1908 Brisbane National Conference. The establishment of a national bank of deposit, issue, exchange and reserve. Deposit meaning accept deposits from the governments, the federal government, the state governments, the municipalities and businesses and people. Exchange meaning accept, discount and rediscount bills of exchange, so it can do the normal business of banking like every other bank does. Issue the currency of the nation through this bank that coordinated the finances of the nation, and that was very important. This was directly from the American system, and it was supposed to be the capital of the bank to have that right to issue. And reserve, hold the capital of the private banks in reserve to regulate and stabilise the banking system. And that last one was the key, because that is what mainstream economists nowadays, they call that a central bank, right? Well, central banking, that part of central banking that is very common nowadays, and as most central banks do it, that didn't start off as central banking. The Bank of England didn't start off doing that. That came out of national banking, right, and has been co-opted to be regarded as a power of central banking. But it means that that's what OMalley wanted, a proper national central bank for Australia. So that was 1908. In 1909, next slide please. In 1909, 1910, the Fisher Labor government came to power. Now, one of the traditions in the Labor Party is that the caucus votes up the cabinet, the ministry, right? So the Prime Minister does not pick who the ministry is. The Prime Minister decides what their job will be. So, because if it didn't work that way, OMalley would never become a minister of the government. But because he had strong support in the caucus, he became a minister in the Fisher government. And can you see his little nemesis down the front there? In the middle, sorry? You know, he would have been, right there he's thinking, get this jackass away from me, you know. Anyway, so this is very important. And OMalley uses that. What we've just skipped over, by the way, is lengthy. In 1909, he gave a 5-hour speech, and I'd like to make that available to anyone. You can ask for orders of it. It's really worth reading this 5-hour speech. We might even, at a minimum, we'll do an almanac with the quotes I've already highlighted. That's worth going through. Just because OMalley, you know, he was the farmer's best friend, right? He just asserted really important principles like interest cannot be allowed to be higher than the natural rate of growth of production, right? Because anything higher than that is usury. That's the principle of interest. He also talked about what they held a royal commission in 1936 to work out why did we have a depression, and the answer was what King OMalley said in 1909 in his speech, which is that in a depression the banks stop issuing credit, right, to cover their own butts, and that kills the economy. That's why you need a national bank backed by the resource of the country that can step in and put all the credit out there that's necessary so no one goes without, right? He was educating people on all the fundamental issues of banking. So anyway, we'll make that available. But 1910, he becomes this minister and he sets up the torpedo brigade and he gets his bank through. Before he did that though, because he'd got the National Bank proposal put on the fighting platform at the 1908 ALP conference, when the Fisher government came to power in 1910, they came to power on the basis of that fighting platform. Then everyone just assumed, oh, well, they'll have to act on a national bank, right? And the private bankers went into overdrive to head it off. And what they did, they held a confidential meeting of senior bankers in Melbourne and they invited the government to be present. So Fisher went along as Prime Minister. OMalley was hoping that he would take him, OMalley, along with him because he, OMalley, was the banker, right? But Fisher didn't. Instead, he took Billy Hughes. And when he came back, he said to the caucus, quote, "The time is not yet ripe to start the bank. The meeting with Australia's leading bankers has convinced me of that fact." Right, so who knows what sort of threats he was subjected to, but when it comes to threats, just a very basic one that wouldn't not even necessarily seem like a threat is just the banks would have told him, I'm sure, listen, you go ahead with this, you risk upsetting our system in London. Right? And of course, everyone in Australia, oh, London, we're at the mercy of London, and that's all he would have had to be reminded of. Where of course, OMalley was not scared of those guys because he knew them backwards. It's interesting the way the 23rd July 1910 issue of the International Socialist newspaper was called reported. Quote, "Andrew Fisher had a secret meeting with the bankers the other day and entered into a compact with the representatives of usury not to let the public know anything about the proposals they made to him or the promises he made to them." So that's when OMalley said, all right, time to get serious, and he set up this torpedo brigade because he just had to use the rules of the party, and the rules of the party was the caucus had the cabinet had to do what the caucus voted up, and he set out to get the numbers in caucus to vote this up, and he achieved it. Now, when he achieved it, here's what happened. Fisher, as soon as the caucus voted up the bank and said, okay, we're going to have this bank, Fisher, obviously mindful of his meeting with the private bankers, took charge from that time on. Nobody outside of King OMalley and a few guys on the conservative side, like Twiggy Forrest's great uncle or whatever, Sir Andrew Forrest, had made any speeches in the Parliament on banking for 10 years. OMalley had made all his speeches on banking, right? Fisher had never made a speech on banking. Billy Hughes had never made a speech on banking. They proudly knew nothing about banking. They said that. But Fisher, as Prime Minister, took charge of the situation. He got a bill drafted. He sent it to private bankers to look over, to approve, and they approved it. And all they ended up setting up as the Commonwealth Bank in 1911 was a bank of deposit and exchange, not of issue and not of reserve, not what OMalley wanted. The Conservatives in the debate on the Commonwealth Bank bill laughed at the government and said, oh, this is OMalley pasteurised. That was the way they put it. OMalley himself did not participate in the debate because he knew this is not what he wanted. But, it all works out in the end because what happened when the Commonwealth Bank, even in this form, started, it actually showed something. And just whip through these pictures so I can... All right, just go back a bit. Here's the thing. What the Commonwealth Bank proved, even though it was started in a limited fashion compared to what OMalley wanted, it proved that the key with national banking is not so much the details of how it works. The key with national banking is the intention. Because very fortuitously for Australia, this Commonwealth Bank that was established as just no different than any other bank except it was owned by the government, for the first 10 years of its life, had a very extraordinary administrator, Sir Denison Miller. And it coincided with a war. And the combination of the two turned this bank into a powerful institution. The first thing is just in this quote here, if you're reading on the screen. Miller, from the beginning, showed that, there's a different way of looking at the world when you've got national credit involved. We don't even need capital, he said. Let's just get it started. We can start lending straight away. We'll start lending out deposits straight away. We don't need to make this bank indebted to someone from the beginning. World War II happened. Flick through. And just leave it there. Is that the list of what they did? Sorry, World War I. Sorry. Okay, so I'll just go through this list. And again, it's significant it's a war because in a war, which I'll talk about more this afternoon, in a war, no one questions the right of a government to be a government. Everyone's scared of losing the war, right? So it puts into stark relief how systems can actually work properly. And that's what was very fortuitous about this. So in this war, the government had no choice. When they wanted to do things, they said, how do we do it? And there's this bank sitting there that can help them at the drop of a hat. And it was brilliant. So they financed the emergency purchase of ships for the Commonwealth shipping line. And that story is fascinating in its own right because Billy Hughes had to do that and use the Commonwealth Bank, and he went to London to do it, and no one in London wanted to sell him any ships, so he had to do it secretly. But how do you get a lot of money secretly? Oh, we've got a bank. They financed these pools of agricultural commodities in everything: wheat, wool, meat, butter, cheese, sugar, fruit, and even rabbits. Oh, that was funny. And what the pools did is kept the farmers in income so they kept producing. The farmers produced, got paid for it, and they didn't have to worry about what happened after that, right? And they got their payment from the Commonwealth Bank. They raised £250 million in 10 war loans from the public, which just that alone saved £10 million in brokerage fees if they had gone through the London banks, right? And that's £10 million if you look at the bottom one. £10 million that they were able to spend on things like infrastructure for local councils. Local councils love this thing, right? All of a sudden they can go to a bank. They need to do something, build a lot of it was for electrification, but roads, bridges, drainage, gas, electricity, tramways, sanitation, harbour improvements and buildings, they didn't have to worry about rates to pay for this. Get it from the Commonwealth Bank at low interest, and they went nuts. And there's huge advances in those days. And then let's just quickly flick through the photos. That's Denison Miller the first day on the job, I think. Next one. And these are some of the pools. So and I put that in there, Stuart, for your benefit, because Stuart's been educating me on CBH, cooperative bulk handling. And look at the way wheat had to be packaged in bags once, right? But Stuart's probably in the photo. All right, next one. Okay, read the captions yourself. Next one. There's wool. Next one. Next one. More wheat. I think that's an abattoir near Newcastle. Keep going. That's mutton ready to go. That's sugarcane crossing a bridge on the way to the Johnston Mill. Yeah, that's right. Keep going. I think that's bags of sugarcane, sugar, right? Keep going. See, if for a war, when you don't have to worry about free markets, it's all about what's the most efficient way to produce and to transport. Keep going. It's one of the ships they bought. Keep going. This is they financed the construction of homes for the returned soldiers and then financed them to buy them. Keep going. This is when they start building electrification systems for local councils. They were big funders of the early stages of hydro scheme in Tasmania. I think there's a picture of that, and there's another one coming up. And yeah, keep going. Chris is asking, was all this achieved just using the bank with two aspects to it of deposit and exchange? Yes, but combined with the necessities of war. Because in the necessities of war, no one questioned the bank doing this. Whereas without a war on, the private banks would have said, why are we competing with that? Right? And you would have had all this malarkey for no reason. Yeah. It's all credit, right? But they didn't have any special controls over that. This is a bad picture, though. Here's why. This is when the bank, in 1920 and then consolidated in 1924, the note issue was given to the bank. So it became it got the issue part, so the third plank that OMalley wanted. But that's the board that controlled it, and Denison Miller's in the middle, but he's only ex officio. And they set up a note issue department through the Commonwealth Bank, overseen by a board that the governor of the bank didn't have a say over, and that proved to be really problematic for the rest of the 1920s, because when they needed notes to be issued, this board, representing private businessmen largely, they did not want to play along at all. All right, is that the last picture? And that's Denison Miller's funeral. I just sort of throw that in there. No, I mean, the guy, yeah, they run these ads on TV today about how the guy who's at the barbecue and says, oh, what do you do? I'm a banker, and he kills the whole thing, right? That's a banker there. All right, sorry, Joe. Okay, so let's leave it there. My final point, just to reinforce it, is what the Commonwealth Bank showed in its first decade is that the key is intention. That's the most important thing. And this afternoon we will talk about how that intention was able to really, well, the intention between the Labor Party and the money power became the real fight over everything. Right? It's not the mechanics that's important, it's the intention of this institution. So thanks very much.
I think we're actually in front of time now.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
Oh, can I keep talking?
Why not? You're on a roll. Has anyone got any questions for Robbie or Joanne?
Bradfield, in his writing that we saw on the screen yesterday, suggested that a big scheme be funded by the Commonwealth at nil interest. Yet our publications in the CEC suggest that we make the interest 1 or 2%. I'm wondering why we can't make up our mind. Why can't we just say 1% or 0%? Because we can do it. You don't need to. We must know what we want. Is it because we don't know what we want? Or, anyway, could you talk on that, Rory, please?
Yes, Joe? Well, here's the thing. As long as there's not an assumption that interest at all is bad, which for plenty of people, when they've, as I said, you first discover what banking is, and a lot of, well, yeah, they get to do that, and you go through and you learn about fractional reserve banking, and Morris brought down from Queensland his copy of I Want the World plus 5%, if anyone's read that, and you read I Want the World plus 5%, and it talks about money, and it talks about here's money, and bankers lend money, and then they used to lend gold, and then they started lending paper on the base of that gold, and then they started lending more paper than they had gold, and then on top of that they charge interest. And where's this interest supposed to come from? And so therefore, how can you pay something that doesn't get issued in the first place? That's the assumption and you know, this system can't work. And it's actually a big ignorance of banking itself, because never is it the case where all the money floating around, the money floating around is only ever a small part of the total wealth in an economy anyway. And economies grow, right? But that's why there's OMalley said, I was struck when Lyndon LaRouche said it last year, there's a principle to interest, because if interest reflects the growth of the physical economy, it can be paid. If it you know, that's interest at 1, 2. OMalley was happy talking about interest up to 3 or 4 or 5%. If interest is in what we're used to now, 8%, 10%, 12%, ridiculous amounts, there's nothing in the natural growth of the economy that can ever pay that. That's when it starts to become usury. So that's there doesn't need to be an assumption that interest is wrong, and we say 1 to 2% because you want to be able to make some decisions as the government of the bank, Jim, at the time. You're in charge. There might be a reason to raise it slightly. You know, it's hard to, well, you should never seek to legislate everything concretely in advance. There might be a margin of it, but what you would not do in principle is go beyond what is reflective of the functioning of the physical economy. And so in our legislation, the way we safeguard it is when we wrote the bill that's in our book, that says explicitly that the way we'll hold this bank to account is if it creates a measurable increase in the energy flux density of industry in the economy and in the relative potential population density of the economy. Because then it's actually helping the economy grow. If the bank starts to become usurious, it will start looting the economy and the economy won't grow, right? And that's the governing principle there. But it's not about being afraid of interest, paying interest.
I'll just say 2 things on it, because one, if you don't have interest, there's no incentive for people to pay back the loan. But also you want to be able to have a variable rate of interest, because I mean, each loan that's given out may not just be across the board, every loan is 1% or every loan is 2%. But you can use the rates of interest to promote, the loans that you want to have happen, you know, local infrastructure, whatever, would have a lower rate of interest, and things, you know, that are higher may not get loaned to at all. Obviously, if somebody wants to, you know, there's always the example of, you know, coming and borrowing money to start a brothel or something, you know. It's obviously not something that the National Bank would necessarily lend money for, but it's a way to, it gives you a way to continue directing the development of your economy. But second of all, interest is crucial because that then gives the bank more money to lend. With both the Reconstruction Finance Corporation and the first and second banks, you know, as the interest payments are coming in, that's more money for the bank to then actually lend out. So it's also useful for the growth of the bank itself to continue expanding.
Graham's saying, doesn't that interest have to be emitted from somewhere in the first place? what I'll do is we will do an almanac and a packet. I want everyone here to sit down, read the Hansard of King O'Malley's 1909 5-hour speech to Parliament. And when you're reading it, remember that this is the guy who created our national bank. This is the guy who was the expert in banking and the American system of banking. And think about his mind. And he takes the time to explain some pretty basic stuff, such as emitted money, notes, coins, whatever. That's a tiny part of the overall money supply. If you have a system based on credits, I think I read one of those quotes, most of the exchange in the economy can be back and forth through credits, and credits are just what a bank can create on the spot against production, right? And the banks can write each other's credits off with each other, pass the paper back and forth to do that, and it's taken care of. It doesn't have to be emitted in the form of an actual source of currency at the beginning. And even today, there's only, I think, 5% of the money supply is actually in the form of currency anyway. Oh, then what do you want to know how Bitcoin's come into this?
No, it's just that. Well, it's just like, you see these things where if, $50 is lent out and then, it's the world plus 5%. Because, so $50 is lent out and then $55 has got to be paid back. Where does the $5 come from? So
from the industry of your investment.
Increased production.
The bank creates it against the increased production.
Yeah.
Robbie,
yes.
just to go over here. We're not covering this in the conference today, but the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, it lent out interest, it lent out loans to the tune of up to $50 billion during the time of the Hoover administration into the time of Franklin Roosevelt, which we know about. But at the basic level of interest there initially started off for a lot of loans at 4%, and then they dropped it down to 3%. But as Joe said, it's got to do with the decision or the intention to of where that money goes to, right? So if it's crucial infrastructure, it might only be 1%. But a lot of the money for the Reconstruction Finance Corporation was loaded to private corporations in order to stimulate and get those companies back to health. And that whilst it was only started from $500 million of capital lent by the Treasury to the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, through the processes of raising money from the public, it ended up lending out something to the vicinity of $50 billion. And every cent of that, with interest, was paid back. And there was absolutely no fraud. So I think the issue of interest comes back to this question of actually growing the economy, because it costs more to the general welfare of the population and to the common good to have the destruction of idle resources, whether that be people being unemployed or industry being unemployed. So actually it's more destructive not to have the credit in the first place.
It's also the difference between I'll just make one last point. It's also the difference between a bailout where you're just giving people money, like George Bush did this. They gave everybody, we all got a check, a tax check, bonus, several $100s. But you're just giving people that money. What are they doing with it? What industry was produced? There was nothing there. So the question of actually loaning money is very different to just handing out money and saying build this or build that. You want the industry, the actual labor of your population increased.
All right, Richard.
Richard from Sydney. Just to say that some interest component is always necessary because interest reflects the risk. Not all debts get paid fully, and some interest is necessary just to safeguard the risk.
And Graham.
Okay. Well, one here first and then over.
Oh,
Graham first.
Graham.
Robbie, I'd just like to ask you, you mentioned Germany right at the beginning about how they financed their reconstruction after the war. Well, the thing was that both Japan and Germany neither had a national bank, but yet they came from total destruction in the war up to 2 and 3 economies in the world following the United States. So could you give us a little bit of a briefing on their efforts?
Yeah, well, they had in Germany you had the Marshall Plan, where America went out of its way to try and help the reconstruction of Europe. But this bank, the KfW Bank, was, it wasn't a national bank, but it was a pretty damn good institution. So it's worth looking that up and read. EIR's published about it, right? They I forget what the translation is, but it was a reconstruction bank. And remember, Roosevelt was not long dead, and I think it was pretty much copied on the American Reconstruction Bank, the KfW Bank. And I'm not as familiar with Japan, except I've read Franklin Douglas MacArthur's biography, and there was thanks to him largely, there was a huge amount of goodwill towards Japanese reconstruction after World War II. Not by the average Yank or Aussie back at home who'd been, had the wartime propaganda about how horrible they were. But, MacArthur had a very benevolent administration in Japan to oversee it, and he was old school. He was American system, and you got to build this economy, right? And I think, I don't know this totally expertly, but I think wasn't there a period, you old guys would remember this better than me, that where Japanese goods were regarded as cheap junk, like today, like we regard the Chinese, and then all of a sudden, they got into real quality, right? Jap crap, yeah. So Dick Smith made money out of it. No, but that reconstruction, in short, Graham, was because of the American assistance towards it was huge, right? And remember, even with the United States in the 1780s and 90s under Hamilton, in that quote I used, there was a role that they had to rely for a certain amount on credit that governments in Europe were willing to lend to them to help inject into their system, right? When you're starting off like that, you often do need help. But what we're talking about in Australia today is not the same thing. We have an industrial economy. We can build on from our own. We've got the resources, we've got the skills, we've got the manpower. I mean, we've still got a little bit of it left. We can build on that. We probably don't need to get that kind of outside help as much as those countries did.
My name is Costas Goumas. What I would like to ask you, please, from all the work the Citizen Electoral Council, did we see any patriotic movement between the Liberal Party or the Labour Party? I know they're all corrupt there, but a lot of these people, they are Australian people, they know English people, are they? And did you see any results? Did you see any one of these people which have some kind ethical feelings to say, this is all true, what we do for Australia?
Yeah, we'll cover a little bit of that this afternoon, at the end of this afternoon's presentation. But the quick answer is, in the late 60s, John Gorton, who was the Prime Minister, collaborated with people in the Labor Party to create the Australian Industry Development Corporation, which wasn't a national bank, but it was an effort to get government back into the role of financing industry. And Gorton's biggest opponents, he was the Liberal Prime Minister, his biggest opponents to the idea was his own Liberal Party. And the main reason it was successful is because Jack McEwen had his back, the Country Party leader. But they were telling him, people like, who came after Gorton? William McMahon. McMahon, who was a total free trader, was telling Gorton, if you pass this, you'll give Whitlam and Jim Cairns a tool to socialise Australia. Right? But it's interesting that Gorton did it, and I'll go through some of that reason why. But that was the last hurrah of it.